Welcome back, welcome back. Here in London this week, we've seen, and you've probably noticed, the G20 meeting of world leaders whose stated aim was to find urgent solutions to the global financial crisis. The G20, of course, brings together representatives from the world's biggest economies, both superpowers like the US and Europe, and emerging giants like Brazil and India. But the world's poorest are often seen to be ignored by the top table, and in an attempt to rectify this, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, came too. He was representing Africa indeed. I had a fascinating talk with him earlier this week about Africa and Ethiopian affairs, which you can see in full next week. But I also asked him about his hopes for the G20 summit itself. You made one very definite positive proposal that the International Monetary Fund should be allowed or permitted or told to sell off part of their gold reserves to help Africa, basically. Mm-hmm. What reaction have you had to that? Do you still think that is a possible solution?
I think that's still the most likely solution to produce results. It's going to be very difficult for countries to honor their pledges in terms of development assistance. They have a lot of money to spend for their own stimulus packages. So we have to find other sources of funding. And the only institution, international institution we have that can, as it were, create money is the IMF. And there are two instruments that we have suggested, sales of gold reserves and the issuance of new SDRs, special drawing rights, which would then be allocated to Africa. We hope to raise something like $30 to $50 billion as a result of this. We have not yet had a clear indication that this is going to fly, but I hope this is accepted by the G20, because that is what we have come here for.
Well, joining me now is Linda Yueh from Oxford University. She's back. Welcome back. And genius from the New York Times, David Sanger, is with us for the first time. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, just first of all, that wish. Did he get his wish?
He got his wish. The G20 yesterday did agree that there would be an extra $500 billion in the special drawing rights that he was referring to, which would essentially open up new ways for some emerging economies to borrow, but also would be used by some others. And then they did agree to some gold sales, which has been an issue that's been running with the IMF for 15 years.
Very good. Well, good for him. How about the rest of us?
Well, I think there were three things they were aiming to do at the summit: shorten the recession, improve regulation, and give more money to the IMF to help developing countries. I think they achieved the third, and not so much in the first two. But if I could just clarify a point that David made, it's actually $750 billion to the IMF, $250 billion is special drawing rights. That's basically creating money, just like we're doing in the West, printing money. And $500 billion is actual money being put in by the EU, Japan, and the US, with the rest coming from China and other big emerging economies. So there's a real pot of money, and then there's a pot which is essentially being created to help the developing world.
That's important to be clear, because reading, people will have read that China's only giving $40 billion, which obviously is not much towards $1 trillion. But in fact, the real cash going in is how much?
I think you had it right. It's $500 billion in new cash that is going in, and then the 250, which has been there before. I think Linda hit on a very important point, which is in a strange way, the G20 did a much better job yesterday in dealing with those countries that have been sort of sideswiped by this entire downturn than they did in addressing the underlying causes. There's almost nothing, as you go through the communique, about how you're going to deal with the toxic assets inside the banks of the largest economies, which is the cause. They have, however, done some things to deal with some of the symptoms and some things that may or may not work to deal with the recurrence.
Yes, because one keeps reading these phrases here, for instance, we've decided to fight back against the global recession. Well, who is that? I mean, who is against us here? Or are we all on the same side? Or is the global recession a thing? Or is it a group of people? Is it Dr. No, wouldn't it be?
Yeah. I think what's happened is the global economy is poised to shrink this year for the very first time since World War II. So I think they're fighting back against the shrinking of world incomes. The only question is, have they put in enough money to do that? If the world economy contracts by 1%, is giving the IMF more money to bail out countries, and then the rest of the trillion is made up by something called trade finance, 250 billion to help exporters get credit lines. Is that really enough of a, is that even a stimulus? And even if it was, if you help developing countries, it prevents them from failing, like well, even Iceland, a developed country that could drag us down in another banking crisis, but it doesn't really stimulate the rich economies. And that was supposed to be the aim of the summit.
All right, rich and poor and all of those, but who's won, and 100 countries watching us right now at this minute, who's lost?
Well,
or did no one lose?
Politically, it seemed fairly clear that this was a good day for Gordon Brown, who desperately did not want this conference to end up being a 1933 London conference failure. He got away without that problem only because they can point to some decisions and accomplishments, even if, as Linda's pointed out, it may not be enough. President Obama said to us last night, both at his big press conference and then in his letter comments, that while he thought they had made some progress, they didn't get any guarantees. And remember, he was playing down the fact that he had to get out of there without any new stimulus for the major economies. And they had basically given up before he arrived, winning that argument with the French and the Germans. President Sarkozy, who saw us after this was over, said that it turned out better than he expected. But since his expectation had been that he was going to be walking out, that may not have been saying much.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. What about China in this equation? Has China become more prominent, more dominant?
I think it has. In many ways, this summit was sort of being billed as the G2. So if you look at, for instance, who's spending to get us out of the recession, there's $1.8 trillion on the table. $1.4 trillion comes from the United States and China. So they are the big engines here. But I think the other way in which China has gained in prominence is that global governance will change. The IMF, by taking money from China, 40 billion compared with 100 billion from the Americans, 100 billion from the Europeans, 100 billion from Japan, it's less, but it's a lot more than what other developing countries are putting in, putting China at the table, and China will have a bigger say in how the IMF is run in the future. So there will be a shift in decision-taking at the IMF and other international organizations away from the Western countries and towards China and developing countries.
And so in this situation, David, there's been a pretty unanimous welcome to what went on yesterday in most places.
And in the markets.
And particularly in the markets, as a specific example. Do you feel positive about it?
I think that as a short-term palliative, I feel fairly good about it. What I feel best about, though, isn't any of the solutions that they came up with, but instead something that Linda has described. We have now seen the next phase of the post-Cold War era. You can never again put the G7, the European powers and Japan and Canada, in a room and expect that they're going to be coming up with a significant decision for the international economy, because we have now had 2 summits in a row that have involved China, India, Brazil, other powers. And there is now an acknowledgement, which I think President Obama was much more willing to make than President Bush was, that these are permanent fixtures and changes in the way we have to run the world. Now, there was a great moment where President Obama said to us last night, you know, it was a lot easier to manage when it was just a couple of us. He said, you know, if you could stuff Roosevelt and Churchill into a room, pour a little brandy, and have them make a few decisions, it's a lot simpler to get through. So this is going to be an ugly system to manage, and we saw that between the French and the Germans and the Chinese and everybody else. But we don't have a choice, because China in particular and other emerging markets have become such a big part of the global economy that it was only a matter of time, and probably long overdue, that they take this role.
Was Obama a winner in this situation? We said which countries were winners and which weren't. Was he more skilled than George Bush would have been, or is that just people being unfair to George Bush?
I think part of it was, you know, he said he was coming to listen, and he did. The White House made a big deal of a very small moment in which he apparently mediated a disagreement that was in the communique between Hu Jintao and President Sarkozy. But it was at least a moment in which the president was able to step in and act as sort of a neutral arbiter, and I think that that was important. He was enormously relaxed at the press conference and seemed very willing to acknowledge both American error and to acknowledge the limits of globalization. He said the Washington Consensus was over. I have not heard an American president say that before.
Thank you both very much. Great to have you both with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all for this week. My thanks to all of our guests, including, of course, these two delightful ones right here. Join me again in 7 days' time for another Frost Over the World.